We started this competition a few years back because I noticed that there was this growing community of taxidermy enthusiasts in Philadelphia, and we kind of don't fit into the hunting lodge, deer on the wall type box. So we needed a place to get together and kind of express ourselves and celebrate what we do, because it is really neat and it's certainly unique, as you'll see.
Whatever you think of when you think of taxidermy, there's always been a range of genres and styles, and a fine balance between fact and fiction, accuracy and creative license. And the field's been evolving for a long time. After hundreds of years, taxidermy's living through yet another incarnation. Today's alternative, or rogue taxidermy, combines species, pairs animals with inanimate objects, and involves a fair amount of glitter.
Kind of. There's a little frostbite. It'll be okay. But this is all rabbit carcasses. I have a giant freezer downstairs that is for all my specimens, and I try to just keep the edible stuff in here. Sometimes they overlap, but I try to keep it somewhat separated. At the moment, I'm working on a pet hedgehog named Pepper, and usually I'll start with a whole animal, and I'll either cut it down the front or down the back. I usually prefer to do a dorsal cut because when you put the form in, you can almost imagine like dropping it into it. It's a lot easier to fit the skin to it. But for this guy, there's no way that I'm going to be able to sew this back up without destroying my hands. Basically, it's a lot like just trying to take a jacket and a pair of socks off of something and peeling all the skin off the carcass.
The first step in taxidermy is skinning the animal. And for this, you need a knife and a strong stomach. Next, any large pieces of fat need to come off. A fleshing machine makes this part easier. Next, the skin gets soaked in a solution made of water, non-iodized salt, and what's essentially dishwashing soap. The salt pulls out the proteins and the soap degreases the skin. This part takes 4 to 6 hours for most animals, but a hippopotamus takes 3 days. Then comes the pickling. The skin soaks in a bath made of water, salt, and acid. The salt buffers the acid so it's not too harsh, and there are several acids to choose from. Formic, oxalic, sulfuric, that's like battery acid, and even citric. The pickling swells the skin, closing the pores and locking in the fur. And finally, the skin is soaked in a chemical tanning bath made out of aluminum-based chemicals like lutan or alum. This takes 10 hours to a whole day. And hundreds of years ago, taxidermists had to rely on much harsher and more toxic chemicals. In the end, the hide is basically leather, just like a belt or a shoe, except it still has its fur.
And then the skin goes onto the form, you sew it up, and then kind of there's a lot of pinning in place, especially around the face. And then unless it's somebody's pet or if it's roadkill, I will try to eat the meat from whatever I've skinned. That's just my own philosophy of not wasting anything.
If you go back far enough, you could say taxidermy's predecessor was mummification, which the Egyptians started doing around 3400 BCE. First to humans, then cats, dogs, and birds. Like taxidermy, mummification was about fighting the inevitable, preserving a body after its death. They had different goals, spiritual versus secular, but they relied on a lot of the same materials. Mummification used things like myrrh, cassia, camphor, frankincense, and cinnamon. Some of these just covered the smell of death. Others, like myrrh, had antifungal and antiseptic properties. And frankincense was an insecticide. Thousands of years later, the desire to preserve bodies continued among other cultures. Just think of religious relics. But the urge to preserve preceded the ability to actually do it well. The first actual taxidermy came in the 13th century, when falconers crudely stuffed birds to use them as hunting and trapping decoys. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, detailed his pretty basic technique in his book on the art of hunting with birds. Number 1, take wing off bird. Number 2, remove flesh. Number 3, rub inside skin with potash to prevent decay and maggots. Number 4, hang wing in chimney to dry. By the so-called age of exploration starting in the 15th century, the taxidermy impulse really got going in Europe, and it was all about curiosity in a world that was simultaneously expanding and shrinking. It wasn't enough to simply relay stories about exotic creatures and plants from these new-to-European lands. In this pre-photography, pre-internet age, people at home wanted to see the actual goods. The problem was they were organic and couldn't make the long journeys intact. In the late 17th century, an English naturalist named James Pettiver suggested the following preservation techniques while at sea. For small animals, preserve them in brandy, rum, or seawater. Or use a spoonful of alum powder. Put in a bottle, cork, and rosin. For larger animals, he said to remove the entrails and stuff with hemp or flax mixed with pitch or tar. Incidentally, the same material used to plug holes in ships. Dry the specimen in the sun, wrap tightly, and keep dry. But nothing worked very well until a breakthrough in the mid-18th century forever changed the practice. And it paved the way for the golden age of Victorian taxidermy making and collecting.
This would have been the entertainment center in your parlor. The first movement are the hummingbirds. And here you see the hummingbirds are jumping from branch to branch, singing their little hummingbird song. In the lower left, you have a bird that is eating. And then you have the warbling bird. He takes a drink and sings his little heart out. Now, if all of that wasn't enough, we're going to add some music. When you're a collector, more or less you want one of everything, or sometimes two. My name is John Whitenight, and I have been a collector and a lover of all things Victorian for well over 40 years. And the bug bit when I was 18 years old, and it has been biting ever since, very heavily. Most of the people that did this collecting were not scientists. They were merchants, they were aristocrats. It morphed into a whole different situation in the 19th century. It became an art form. It wasn't just doing it for scientific reasons. You wanted to show people, when you had people come to your home, that you were aware of the natural world. You looked at the natural world, you studied the natural world, you appreciated the natural world, and therefore you wanted to be surrounded by the natural world. Let me just check my situation here. The big birds, they're by James Gardner from about 1870. They're magnificent, by the way. The whole socioeconomic situation was developing, and the 19th century created the middle class. If you shot a prime pheasant, you could afford to have it preserved and put into your cottage. There were hundreds and hundreds of taxidermy shops, particularly in England. Every small town, every hamlet had a taxidermist. Most of the specimens before the 19th century were presented in a rather stiff manner with very little animation. So I call it the rigor mortis look.
And so what happened?
John James Audubon. He was the one that took birds and mammals and put them in very animated poses. So no longer were birds just standing there looking wide-eyed, straight ahead. Their wings were spread, their beaks were open, on paper and under glass. And the other part of it too is the whole chemistry of it was changing. Animals could be preserved more readily with the use of arsenic.
The importance of arsenic in taxidermy's history can't be overstated. It was a major game changer. For years, taxidermists struggled to preserve their creations. Then, in 1738, a French ornithologist named Jean-Baptiste Becquer created a formula that would forever change taxidermy. It was so good, he tried to keep it a secret for the rest of his life. The key ingredient was arsenic. Arsenic is a highly toxic chemical element that's also a really effective insecticide. It stops cells in a body from working properly and eventually kills them. Becquer ran 50 chemical trials on 50 specimens to determine the effectiveness of a formula that combined arsenic with camphor, potassium carbonate, powdered calcium hydroxide, and soap. It was known as arsenical soap, and it was so effective it became industry standard. So do you worry about the arsenic in your collection?
No, not at all.
How come?
Most of the specimens are contained under glass, so I don't worry about it for a second. I would be more worried about the content of formaldehyde in all the products that are coming into our homes, rather than worrying about an antique piece of taxidermy.
Victorian taxidermy was all about science, but it was also about aesthetics and spectacle. And some taxidermists took these elements further than others. Walter Potter was the preeminent anthropomorphic taxidermist of the Victorian era. And it's easy to see how his work might have influenced the new wave of taxidermists today.
Now, the story goes that this is a goat from Whiston Park, which is a big manor house. And this goat was constantly breaking out of its paddock. Well, unfortunately, one day it broke out for the last time, and it was hit by a team of horses, and the goat was killed. The monkey was a pet in a nearby town, and the monkey was notorious for stealing fruit from the greengrocer. So one day the greengrocer saw the monkey come, and he took a bucket of ice water and he dumped it on the monkey. The monkey went into shock and died of a heart attack. So Mr. Potter thought it was only appropriate that these two rascals should be sent off into the sunset in perpetuity.
As the taxidermy under glass trend died out with the Victorian era, 20th century natural history museums picked it up, went bigger, and put animals behind glass. That same curiosity that motivated 16th century explorers to search out new lands and collect foreign species continued into the 1900s. Carl Akeley is one of the biggest stars of this era of taxidermy, and he's perhaps best known for punching a leopard to death with his bare hand, from the inside of the leopard, after it attacked him and was on its way to eating his arm and probably the rest of him. He also famously mounted a 6-ton elephant for P.T. Barnum. Akeley revolutionized the Natural History Museum's habitat diorama, scenes that showed groups of animals in their natural settings. He focused on anatomical correctness and approached the craft as both a scientist and an artist. The lightweight mannequins he developed were used throughout the golden age of Natural History Museum dioramas. Though Akeley might have been the first to make an accurate habitat diorama, at least one other taxidermist beat him to making dioramas in general. Martha Maxwell was a naturalist from Colorado, and the first female naturalist to collect and mount her own specimens. She was a pioneer and a vegetarian, and she showed off her diorama highlighting the animals of the West at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, with a sign in front that read, "Woman's Work." One of the original motivations behind habitat dioramas was a new public concern about conservation in the early to mid-20th century. Ironically, natural history museums addressed these environmental concerns by going all over the world and killing a lot of animals, many of which are now endangered, if not extinct.
What they would do is they would form a expedition, and we're talking about, the director of the exhibits department, scientists who were on staff, a crew of artists, some of the museum's benefactors or funders would be coming. It was a big adventure. They would scout a location and find what they could envision being the location of the diorama. And this is really important. Many, if not all of these dioramas are an actual place where you could stand and see that backdrop and those animals. They would take studies, so they would collect specimens from the grass and the trees and the leaves. Sometimes if they were in a dangerous area, they might have a hunter looking out for them to make sure that they weren't ambushed by dangerous animals. And so they would collect as much information about the region as they could. Sometimes down to the time of day, what the light was like, what season it was. And then what they would do is they would collect, is the kind word for shoot, or capture the animals that they wanted in the diorama, and they took very detailed measurements of all of those particular animals. Then they would skin them and bring everything back to the museum. They did very little else in the field. They just collected, came all the way back, and then they did the work of putting and piecing together the story, which of course was as accurate as it could be, but it's also, enhanced. It was realistic, but it also has a person involved in it who wants to communicate something. So we have a lot of symbolic storytelling elements here, telling us that this is a family with a father in charge of the family, he's defending the family. But the funniest thing about this is not how gorillas actually live. They are generally solitary males. They are not particularly aggressive. But nobody wanted that story. What they wanted was the story of the capturing and controlling this gorilla.
Even though people still visit the Academy of Natural Sciences' 45 dioramas every day, they're not making any new ones. Over the years, laws and environmental views changed, and people just didn't need museums to bring the world to them in the same way anymore. TV and the internet kind of did that. Today's rogue taxidermists are on the opposite end of the collecting spectrum from Natural History Museum dioramas. For them, it's more about becoming familiar with the wildlife that surrounds us every day.
I was the window dresser for Daffy's, and not necessarily the store windows, but all the buildings around, birds would fly into them, and you'd see them on the sidewalk. It broke my heart that people would either just kick them to the side or step on them. And so I just bought this vintage book on how to do taxidermy, and I started picking the birds up and taking them home. And then rumor gets around town that if you see a dead bird, call this girl because she'll come pick it up. And so I just started collecting like seagulls and pigeons and sparrows and starlings. And then I actually found out much, much later that it's completely illegal to collect a lot of those birds. They're all protected, but I didn't know that at the time. And then I just practiced and then started buying whole pheasants from the butcher. We're working with styrofoam.
What inspired you to make this?
I photograph creepy dolls.
That's your main thing?
Yeah, and I collect taxidermy, even though I have pet rabbits.
How's this process for you?
It's been a little rough with the head when I look straight into its face, because I'm vegetarian too.
So did you tell anyone like, hey, I'm taking this class, I'm vegetarian, I have pet rabbits, and did anyone think that was odd?
Yes, everybody I talked to. Yeah.
I'm here because it's all about taxidermy, And I can see by the look of the other entrants that I'm here to represent a bit more of the traditional. My preference is traditional taxidermy, done well, done beautifully. I know that they are rogue taxidermists, and they're artists, and they're using taxidermy in their own way, as their own art form. So, I'm open to that. Do they know? Do they have a real working historical perspective? I don't know.
All right, to conclude this evening's event, we're going to announce our first place winner. And we are very honored to say that tonight's winner is Karen from the Porcupine.
Recently, I was struck by an insight that brought me to my knees. I'm continually drawn to the broken, damaged, and often mangled forms of animals whose lives have been cut short, often in violent ways. When I am able to rescue these lifeless forms and create something new, it feels like a personal triumph. Each creature I touch is a little piece of my soul. You may see something morbid, disgusting, and broken. I see the potential and opportunity that hides beneath the battered bodies. Working with blood, flesh, and bone is an intimate and organic process. In the hours I spend with each dead animal, a personal connection develops that borders on love. Every time it works, when something is preserved and made new, my soul claims a victory. I heal myself with every scrape and stitch.
Our house is not inanimate to us, nor are these things. Most of these things were created 150, 100 years ago. What has gone past them? Who have they seen? Who have they witnessed? There's nothing cold or nothing frightening about it. It's just wonderful.